Hi, we pick up in 1 Samuel 17 today and verse 31. And as we do, I'm going to be noting that we're returning to the part in the non-bold you see on the screen here that we've been following this with, where we see the bold parts are the parts that are only in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew version, and the unbolded parts are the parts that are in the Septuagint, the Greek version, but not in the Hebrew Bible. So this section that we've been looking at, all this bold section here, is in the Hebrew but not in the Greek. So if we were to be reading the Greek, which some scholars think is the original, the story ends here with Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine. They were dismayed and greatly afraid, and picks up here. David said to Saul, let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. And if we have that, though, we lose several elements of the story that the Masoretic text verses here allow us to hear as transitions. One is the movement of David away from his father Jesse and toward Saul, and the question of his loyalty, first to his family and then maybe to Saul the king, or maybe to Yahweh, or maybe to the people of Israel. Another element we see in the bold part that's not in the Septuagint is the question of a reward for someone who would kill the Philistine. And so there are a number of elements we'll have to read the story we're on here in more than one way to make sense of the narrative context. Another element that we've been looking at too is how this whole story is part of one of three presentations of David, whether to Saul or to the audience both in the story, the Israelites, and then the audience who's listening to it then and now. And when our story ends here, it'll be as if Saul has never met David before, as we see down here. He asks his chief of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? And Abner says, I don't know. But they've just had a conversation, although they haven't talked to each other by name directly. So there are a number of pieces of how both the Septuagint and the Hebrew text fit together to create a continuous narrative, and how this chapter fits with the chapter before to have a continuous narrative or not. And we'll see that as it goes. So as we look at this chiastic shape of this section, we're picking up here, and we're going to look at 31 to 37 today, the conversation with David and Saul that I'll show you in just a minute. And we'll see how there are some parallels here, but not a lot, because this is all about David and his family until he arrives at the battle, and the question becomes, what is the reward? What will the king give for someone who will kill the Philistine champion? And so let's look briefly at the shape of this. I wanted to highlight this here. We noted in the last video in 20 to 30, verses 20 to 30, how much there was talk about talking. You can see that here in the last verse up on the screen on the left side. He turned away from him toward another, that's David, and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. In other words, words aren't being said there, they're being reported indirectly. The same in our first verse here, 31, which continues to be part of the previous Hebrew Bible part. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for them. In both these situations, we don't hear what they're saying. We just hear the narrator say either the words were spoken the same way and the people answered in the same way, or words were heard. But now we're going to hear the words, and I just want to note something about this as we go. It's a conversation just between two people, and yet there's a number of times the narrator makes the point of who's talking to who. And I put this in blue here because this is the one that's the exception, where David said, and we'll look and see what that might be saying about the larger picture. One other thing we're going to look at here, you see that I have lion and bear highlighted here. We're going to see both something about lions and bears in this area, which they're not nowadays, and lions and bears in the Bible, and where there might be a sly criticism of this story in Isaiah as well as in the prophets Hosea and perhaps also in Amos. So with all that preparation, let's just jump in. And we're starting here in verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, echoing verse 23. Here, let's go back to that so you can see what I mean. And David heard him, the Philistine. So now David is hearing here, back to here. They heard the words that David spoke. They repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. So Saul now enters into the story, and David says to Saul, like he knows him, and Saul responds like he knows him, even though neither of them refer to each other by name or by title. David never calls Saul the king, and Saul never refers to David by any title. David simply refers to Saul in the deferential royal way, your servant. And we'll look at that as we go. So he starts this way. Let no one's heart fail because of him. It's an odd phrase in Hebrew, as you can see down here. Yapol lev Adam aliv. Adam is the normal word for human beings in general, and yet it's singular here. So it's an odd thing. Literally, it's toward falling a person's heart on. So translators have tried to work that out, and what they get here is let no one's heart fail because of him, changing falling into failing. But we get the idea, don't be discouraged. Your servant, and as my note here says, David adopts the language of royal vassalage repeated 3 times in these 5 verses. And if we read the previous story before chapter 17, as I was noting, where David becomes the musician that soothes the evil spirit in Saul, then we already know that David is a servant, and Saul understandably recognizes him. It's his servant who's been hired to be his musician, who now is stepping up and offering this to go. And that certainly makes sense of this scene, and that Saul doesn't say, "Who are you?" Let's look a little closer at what's actually said. So we'll go and fight. The word for go, helek, is 5 times in this little section, 3 times with fight. So it's a key word in this little section, along with the key words that we've been seeing throughout. So we see it right here. And fight with this Philistine, again using zeh, which we've seen a number of times, and it's highlighted here as a critical word. It's obviously just a generic word, this, but it carried a negative connotation in Hebrew usage, as if it's a put down. So this nobody, this not even can speak of, this Philistine. And in fact, in a moment, he'll be compared with animals. So Saul responds to David, "You are not able to go up against him." And this is repeating David's earlier words, almost verbatim, echoing Goliath, who said, Goliath said, "You can't go up against him." And ironically, David, as my note from Falkman notes, practically echoes the sentiment that his lack of experience makes him unable to fight. And we'll see how that goes as we continue here. You're not able to go against this Philistine using the same language, for you were just a Na'ar, a boy. Whereas Goliath is described as a youth here, a Norim. Youth, a Norim, is rare. It's only one other time in Samuel, and we see it in these couple of times in the Deuteronomistic history. But Na'ar is common. Na'ar is a couple hundred times. And so what we're looking at here is their comparative youth. Saul's saying all his life since he was a child, Goliath, this Philistine, was raised to be a warrior. Saul doesn't say you were a shepherd. He says just you're small. You're just a young man, like the Na'ar that Saul took with him when he was looking for Samuel back in chapter 9. But he doesn't know about David's youth, and so David will tell him. And so we get here that, as Falkman notes, 1734 to 37, which is the relatively long speech here, as we can see, echoes Goliath's speech, taunting. And it's allegorical for his royal heroics. We could easily substitute lions and bears for enemy peoples and lambs for the people of Israel. And certainly the prophets and the psalmists do that. And to the extent that David is understood as a psalmist, or at least the psalmists are echoing styles of David, we would find that they're echoing this here. We'll see a negative echo before we're done, though, today. So your servant used to keep, the New Revised Standard has, and that's a very misleading translation. It would reinforce the notion that I was promoting in the last 2 videos, that the text is showing David slowly moving away from the vocation of serving his father's sheep and moving to the vocation of serving Saul, his new quote-unquote father. But it's actually a bad grammatical translation. As Sumura notes, has been shepherding. But if you look at a variety of English translations, you see all these ranges of things, both in terms of the tense, of whether he's still doing it or not, but also in terms of the word. Used to keep sheep versus have been keeping or has kept, was tending or shepherding, take care of or guarding. So all the different substantive words can be different, all more or less expressing the same notion that he was taking care of the sheep. But the main issue is whether he's still doing it, and the word in Hebrew is a participle, and so we can certainly see here he's still naming himself as still doing it. And then he goes on and says, whenever a lion or a bear, the last lion in the Bible was the lion that Samson dealt with, and there's no mention of the proverbial enemies of sheep here, wolves, which is an odd thing. Lions are only 7 times in the Masoretic text, and 2 are in Isaiah's peaceable kingdom passage, which we'll look at in just a minute. So one of the things we can consider here, what about lions and bears, or wolves for that matter, at that time? There certainly aren't lions in Israel if you go visit now, nor are there bears walking down the streets of Jerusalem, nor in the woods, as far as I'm aware. So let's take a quick look at the distribution of lions and bears and wolves in that area in the ancient world. So you can see that here are the distribution of lions, and it's the same species of lion we'd see elsewhere. So there are plenty of lions in that area. The bears here at issue are the Arabian bears, I'm sorry, the Syrian bears. So they're a specific species of brown bear, subspecies of brown bear, and you see where those are there. And then there's the Asiatic wolf, which is not very common, and so that's one reason perhaps why wolves aren't mentioned here in that same way. So let's look and see what David says about this, and then we'll look at some Hebrew scripture passages that may be a commentary on this. So he says, whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down. Let's move down our passage a little bit and see our whole thing. I struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth, and if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. That's a relatively long speech for David to be giving here. Let's look at it in a little more detail. So he's facing off lions and bears, and we might not have thought of shepherds as having to take care of those. When Jacob says to Laban of what the work of being a shepherd was, he simply speaks of not getting much sleep and being out in the heat and the cold. He doesn't talk about lions and bears, but that's where David goes here, because his goal is not to show he has stamina, but to show he has the strength to kill. And so he says, I went after it and struck it down, using the exact same verse as the key word for the fight against Goliath, rescuing the lamb using nitzal, which can be a word for salvation or rescue, which will be the description in verse 47 that Yahweh has rescued the Israelites from the Philistines. And if it turned against me, or if it literally stood up on me, so the issue isn't that it's turning, the issue is it's a lion or a bear rearing up against him, I would catch it. And the word here, chizuk, from the Hiphil means to make strong or display strength, and that'll also be echoed in 1750. So we're seeing that his metaphorical example, or his examples from experience, become metaphorical for the actual killing of Goliath and the ridding of the Philistines from the scene, at least for now. Catch it by the jaw, and as Bodner notes with a certain irony here, the OSV evidently unable to imagine the notion of a bearded bear, because Zakan clearly means beard. A person who's Zakan means an old man. So caught it by the beard, and you could certainly grab a bear more easily by the fur or the beard around its mouth than grabbing it by the jaw, strike it down and kill it. And so notice he's referring here either to the lion or bear that he would grab it. It's hard to imagine grabbing a lion that way. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. As Fackelman notes down below, it robs the Philistine of the unique feature to which he had recourse in 8c, and of the pretension to be outside the ordinary rules of the game. Let's go back to that here, as he says, am I not a Philistine? And so he's going to be just like one of them. And this is part of the othering we've seen of the Philistines throughout, that although the Philistines historically, and certainly the authors of the story, unless they were writing really late, would have known this, were at least as sophisticated, if not more so, than the Israelites, evidence being their swords and metal weapons, and the Israelites, their wooden weapons and lack of metal weapons. But they're being othered as an excuse to treat them the way that David would treat lions and bears. And so he says that that's what he will do, and now he tripped it to Yahweh. Finally, for the first time, he says Yahweh. Let's go back one part of the verse, because I didn't look at this last part. He has defied the armies of the living God. And there's living God here without it referring to Yahweh. The phrase armies of the living God is repeated from 26 when David first said that, and we looked at it briefly there, so I won't repeat that. But in the next verse, he refers to Yahweh for the first time. As Brueggemann notes, praising David a little bit, no one else in the story has named the name of Yahweh. Others are cowards because they've abandoned their only source of courage. But I would challenge the esteemed Walter Brueggemann on this just a little bit. Yes, David is calling upon Yahweh, but does David really have a relationship with Yahweh, or is this just divine legitimation for the violence that he's going to engage in defeating the Philistine, and presenting for the text and for readers of this text throughout history the sense that Yahweh was on the side of this? But we don't don't know that. We just know he's claiming that Yahweh who saved me from the paw, or literally from the hand of. And my note down here notes that the hand theme, the hand of Yahweh, and David's hand playing the kinnor is a major theme in here, and we'll look at that more as we go. So although the translators rendered it paw to make it anatomically correct, really it's the various hands that are at issue. So Yahweh, who saved me from the hand of the lion and from the hand of the bear, will save me from the hand of this Philistine. That's the point. So having followed the theme of the lion and bear, I want to go back to our chart, to the blue section that I highlighted on the dialogue here between David and Saul. I made that blue because of two elements. First of all, we note that in all the others it says who spoke to who. David said to Saul, Saul said to David. But here, while David was already speaking, and so we didn't need David said because he was already speaking, as you can see, the narrator puts in there David said, but it doesn't say to Saul. So this perhaps is to suggest that David is saying more broadly this theological statement that for many people is the center of the whole thing. Yahweh will save me from the hand of this Philistine. So that perhaps is being directed by it not being said, David said to Saul, who he's obviously continuing to speak to, that this is being said directly to the audience, perhaps as we say in modern TV movies, breaking the fourth wall. So Saul said to David, go and may Yahweh be with you. So now we have both David claiming Yahweh's on his side and Saul verifying it. But is Yahweh on the side of this? What the text is basically saying is Yahweh is on the side of using violence to destroy the enemy. And that's part of a pattern in the Hebrew Bible that I refer to as the religion of empire in my book, Come Out My People. I don't want to get in that a whole lot about my book, but I do want to highlight how this text here is at least implicitly challenged by other Hebrew Bible texts which present the relationship of lions and bears and Yahweh a little differently. Let's look at this pair from Isaiah. First, the classic from Isaiah 11, and then the verse from Isaiah 65 that echoes it. So let's listen to this and note the colored sections here. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. On that day the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples. The nations shall inquire of him, and his dwelling shall be glorious. And then echoing in the later part of Isaiah, the wolf and the lamb shall feed together, the lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent, its food shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountains, says Yahweh. We won't worry about the serpent part, obviously referencing the Garden of Eden story there. This section from Isaiah 65 certainly being much later than the section from Isaiah 11. But the question of the root of Jesse there is a really important one. David is plainly not the root of Jesse, he's the stem of Jesse, to the extent that the father is the root, and we talk about hereditary tree in people's lives, and you look for the roots, your genealogical roots. So David is certainly not the root of Jesse. So this is not a video on Isaiah, so I won't worry about that there. But plainly the reference to Jesse is a reference to the notion of David and the promise of David. It's the only Jesse we know of here. And so what we're seeing in Isaiah is an alternative to what we see in our text in 1 Samuel. Rather than killing the enemy, what about creating a peaceful situation where everybody knows the knowledge of Yahweh, and animals and people and people and people all live together in peace, with the little children leading them? And to the extent that David in the story is a Na'ar, a boy, as Saul called him, perhaps that's another way that the child could have been a leader here. Rather than expressing his pride and his ability to kill, maybe it could have been his pride and ability to get along. That's part of the pattern I call the religion of creation. And the religion of creation pattern, at least in one way of it, and the religion of empire pattern is its opposite, argue with each other throughout the text of the Hebrew Bible. And that's one of the interesting things about it. So Genesis, as I read it, is a religion of creation text, arguing against what we see here. Let's look at another example from Hosea, so we can see it's not an isolated example. So this from Hosea 13, 5 to 11. And Yahweh is the voice here. It was I who fed you in the wilderness in the land of drought, which is obviously referencing the Exodus story. When I fed them, they were satisfied. They were satisfied, and their heart was proud. Therefore, they forgot me. So I will become like a lion to them, like a leopard. I will lurk beside the way. I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs, and will tear open the covering of their heart. There I will devour them like a lion, as a wild animal would mangle them. I will destroy you, O Israel. Who can help you? Where now is your king that he may save you? Where in all your cities are your rulers, of whom you said, give me a king and rulers? I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. So Hosea plainly referencing, or at least indirectly, the story in 1 Samuel 8 about give me a king and rulers there, and basically arguing that the problem that has made Israel rebellious is they put their pride in their king and forget Yahweh. And so Yahweh will become like a lion or a bear or a leopard for them and attack them and leave them defenseless. And so we see, whether it's from the passage from Hosea or the reference parallel, they're a little bit parallel, not exactly from Amos, or the Isaiah passages, that the authors of the prophetic passages suggest a different way of engaging between humans and animals, and humans and other humans who may be symbolically represented by those animals. So that's where our passage, we're going to stop today, and we'll continue with Saul literally trying to clothe David with his armor, and we'll see that it's not a good fit. See you that for next time. Bye-bye.